Forget the cozy log cabins and crackling fires you've seen in movies. For the first American pioneers of how wood freezes solid and why your own breath could become a lethal layer of ice inside a sod dugout.
When the temperature drops to 40 below, your body becomes a chemistry experiment gone wrong. In this environment, hypothermia is discovered through tests.
How do you build a home when there are no trees and the very ground beneath you is frozen like Grant? The pioneers didn't just survive, they engineered life out of raw, frozen science.
Winter on the American frontier was not simply a season. It was a test of endurance that shaped the lives of early pioneers and determined who would survive long enough to see spring. Long before railroads connected cities or modern furnaces warmed homes, settlers pushing west into the wilderness faced winters that were colder, longer, and far more dangerous than anything most people today could imagine. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American pioneers began moving beyond the original 13 colonies. Many families traveled into territories such as Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and later Illinois and Missouri. These regions offered rich soil and opportunities for land ownership, but they also came with brutal winters that caught many newcomers unprepared. Unlike established towns along the East Coast, frontier settlements often lacked roads, stores, and reliable supplies. When snow fell and rivers froze, isolation became complete. Most pioneer families traveled west during late spring or summer, hoping to build shelter before the first snow arrived. Time was their greatest enemy. A family arriving too late in the season often faced disaster. Cutting trees, shaping logs, and building a cabin required weeks of hard labor. Without walls and a roof before winter, survival chances dropped sharply. The typical pioneer cabin was simple but effective. Settlers used axes to fell tall hardwood trees, then trimmed branches and stacked the logs horizontally to form walls. The spaces between logs were filled with mud, clay, or moss in a process called chinking. This helped block wind and trap warmth inside. Roofs were usually made of wooden shingles or overlapping slabs of bark. Floors were sometimes packed earth at first, later replaced with wooden planks when time allowed. Fire was the heart of survival. Nearly every cabin contained a large stone fireplace, built wide enough to provide heat and cook meals at the same time. In winter, fires burned day and night. If the fire went out during a freezing night, temperatures inside the cabin could drop dangerously low. Pioneers learned quickly to keep extra firewood stacked nearby, often under a lean-to structure attached to the cabin. Collecting enough firewood before winter was one of the most important tasks pioneers faced. Families cut wood continuously during fall, splitting logs into manageable pieces and stacking them in tall piles. A single winter could require several cords of wood, depending on how harsh the weather became. If supplies ran short, settlers were forced to venture into deep snow and bitter winds to gather more wood, a task that could lead to frostbite or exhaustion. Clothing played a major role in winter survival. Most pioneers did not have access to factory-made garments. Instead, families produced their own clothing from materials like wool, linen, and animal hides. Women spun wool from sheep into yarn, then wove cloth and sewed garments by hand. Heavy coats, mittens, scarves, and wool socks were essential for staying warm. Buckskin jackets made from deer hides were especially valued because they blocked wind and provided durability. Preparation for food before winter was another matter of life and death. Without refrigeration or nearby markets, pioneers depended on preserved food supplies. During autumn, families harvested crops such as corn, beans, squash, and potatoes. They dried fruits like apples and berries, storing them in sacks or wooden barrels. Meat from hunting or livestock was salted, smoked, or dried into jerky to prevent spoilage. Salt was one of the most valuable supplies on the frontier. It allowed pioneers to preserve meat for months, ensuring they had protein during long winters. Salt was not always easy to obtain, and some settlements relied on distant trade routes or natural salt licks where animals gathered. Protecting stored food from rodents and moisture was another challenge. Many cabins included storage lofts or root cellars dug into the ground, where cooler temperatures helped keep food fresh. Water sources often froze during winter, creating additional hardship. Rivers, creeks, and wells sometimes developed thick layers of ice. Pioneers used axes to break through ice and draw water. In severe conditions, snow was melted inside the cabin to provide drinking water. This required extra fuel, making wood supplies even more important. Transportation nearly stopped once heavy snow arrived. Dirt roads became buried under drifts, and wagons could not move easily. Travel on foot or horseback remained possible, but it was slow and dangerous. Settlements separated by only a few miles could become completely isolated for weeks. If illness or injury struck, help might not arrive in time. Despite these challenges, pioneers learned to adapt and share knowledge. Communities formed where neighbors helped one another gather supplies, build cabins, and survive storms. Cooperation became one of the most valuable survival tools on the frontier. A lone family faced greater risk, while a cluster of settlers working together improved everyone's chances. One of the greatest threats during early frontier winters was unexpected weather. Sudden blizzards could arrive with little warning, bringing heavy snowfall and fierce winds. These storms buried cabins, blocked doors, and sometimes collapsed weak structures. Settlers often marked paths between buildings with wooden stakes so they could navigate even when snow covered the ground completely. Animals also played a role in survival. Horses provided transportation, while oxen helped pull wagons and plows. Chickens supplied eggs, and cows offered milk when conditions allowed. During winter, feeding animals required careful planning. Hay and grain had to be stored ahead of time because grazing became impossible once snow covered the fields. Children on the frontier grew up learning survival skills at an early age. They helped gather firewood, fetch water, and care for animals. Education often took place at home during winter months when outdoor work slowed slightly. Parents taught reading, writing, and arithmetic by candlelight, using limited materials such as handwritten books or slates. Winter nights were long and dark, stretching across many hours. Without electric lighting, cabins depended on candles made from tallow or beeswax. These candles produced dim light and needed constant replacement. Families often gathered around the fireplace in the evenings, sharing stories, mending clothing, or carving tools to prepare for the next season. Disease presented another danger during cold months. Illness spread quickly in close quarters, especially when ventilation was poor. Pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory diseases were common threats. Medical care was limited, and settlers relied on home remedies, herbal treatments, and practical knowledge passed down through generations. The first American pioneers who survived winter on the frontier earned more than just land. They gained experience that shaped settlement patterns and influenced how future communities prepared for seasonal hardships. Each winter tested their strength, patience, and determination. Those who endured became the foundation of expanding American territory, proving that survival depended not only on courage, but also on preparation and cooperation. As winter settled deeper across the frontier, the real test began. Food stores dwindled slowly, temperatures dropped further, and the true meaning of endurance revealed itself in the daily routines of pioneer life. The lessons learned during those early months would determine how settlers faced the harshest storms yet to come.
As the first heavy snows settled across the frontier, the daily rhythm of pioneer life changed dramatically. Autumn work had been fast and urgent, but winter demanded patience and careful planning. Once deep snow covered the land, outdoor tasks became slower and more dangerous, yet survival still depended on steady effort every single day. Inside the cabin, the fireplace became more than a source of heat. It was the center of life. Cooking, drying clothes, warming hands, and even preserving tools all happened near the flames. Pioneer families learned to control fire carefully, feeding it enough wood to maintain warmth without wasting valuable fuel. Sparks from the fire were a constant threat, especially in cabins built from dry logs. A single stray ember could ignite bedding or clothing, turning a shelter into a deadly trap. To reduce fire danger, pioneers often cleared a space of bare earth or stone in front of the fireplace. Iron tools such as pokers and tongs helped manage burning logs safely. Many cabins also used crane hooks inside the fireplace, allowing pots and kettles to hang over the flames at adjustable heights. This simple method made cooking more efficient and helped conserve fuel. Food during winter was simple but filling. Corn became one of the most important crops for survival. It could be ground into meal and used to make bread, porridge, or johnny cakes. Beans, dried peas, and preserved squash provided additional nutrition. Salted pork was a common source of meat, especially when hunting became difficult. Meals were rarely large, but pioneers focused on eating enough calories to maintain strength in freezing temperatures. Grinding corn into meal required steady effort. Many settlements built small grist mills powered by water, but in isolated areas, families relied on hand mills. These tools used heavy stones to crush dried kernels into coarse flour. The work was physically demanding and often took hours, but without it, bread could not be made. Winter hunting played an important role in supplementing food supplies. Snow created both challenges and advantages. Animals left clear tracks in the snow, making it easier to follow deer, rabbits, or wild turkeys. At the same time, deep drifts slowed hunters and increased the risk of getting lost. Pioneers learned to read signs in the snow, studying footprints and broken branches to locate game. Fur-bearing animals such as foxes, raccoons, and beavers were especially valuable. Their pelts provided warmth and could be traded for tools, ammunition, or salt. Trapping became a common winter activity, with settlers setting steel traps or snares along known animal paths. Checking traps regularly was essential, even during severe cold. Frozen fingers and numb toes were common risks during these long journeys into the woods. Clothing required constant maintenance throughout winter. Wet garments could freeze stiff and become useless. After traveling outdoors, pioneers hung coats, gloves, and boots near the fire to dry. Leather footwear needed regular oiling to prevent cracking in cold weather. Women spent many winter evenings sewing patches onto worn clothing, reinforcing weak areas to extend their lifespan. Blankets were another important defense against cold. Most were made from wool, which trapped heat even when slightly damp. Families often slept together in shared beds to conserve warmth. Children slept beside parents or siblings, wrapped tightly under layers of heavy fabric. In particularly cold conditions, hot stones wrapped in cloth were placed near feet to provide extra heat through the night. Ventilation inside cabins was a delicate balance. While sealing cracks helped keep warmth inside, smoke from the fireplace needed an escape path. Chimneys built from stone or clay carried smoke upward, but poor construction sometimes caused smoke to drift back into the room. Breathing smoky air could irritate lungs and cause long-term health problems. Snowstorms were among the feared winter events. Blizzards could last for days, with strong winds driving snow against cabin walls until doors were buried. Settlers often tied ropes between the cabin and nearby structures, like barns or storage sheds. This allowed them to move between buildings without becoming lost in whiteout conditions. During major storms, families stayed indoors as much as possible.
Windows were small and sometimes covered with animal skins or greased paper instead of glass. This reduced heat loss but allowed only limited light inside. Storms often created deep silence outside, broken only by the sound of wind striking the cabin walls. Children played an important role even during harsh weather. They gathered kindling, carried water, and helped feed animals. Learning responsibility at a young age was necessary for survival. In many frontier families, every person contributed, regardless of age. Animals required special attention during winter months. Barns provided shelter from wind and snow, but feeding livestock remained difficult. Stored hay had to last until spring, and families carefully measured portions to avoid running out too early. Water troughs froze quickly, forcing settlers to break ice daily so animals could drink. Livestock illnesses were especially dangerous during winter. A sick cow or horse could mean losing milk, transportation, or farming power. Pioneers often used herbal remedies and practical knowledge to treat animals. Protecting livestock from cold winds became just as important as feeding them. Isolation weighed heavily on many families. Weeks could pass without seeing neighbors, especially during severe weather. Loneliness became part of frontier life, particularly for women and children who spent long hours indoors. To pass the time, families told stories, played simple games, or sang songs passed down from earlier generations. Reading materials were rare but treasured. A single book, often a Bible or almanac, might serve as both entertainment and education. Almanacs provided useful information about weather patterns, planting times, and phases of the moon. These details helped settlers prepare for future seasons. Candle making was another important winter task. Tallow, rendered from animal fat, was melted and poured into molds with cotton wicks. The resulting candles burned slowly but produced smoke and a strong odor. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but beeswax was less common and usually saved for special occasions. Winter also brought moments of danger that tested courage. Frozen rivers sometimes tempted travelers to cross quickly, but thin ice could break without warning. Falling into icy water often meant certain death from hypothermia. Experienced settlers tested ice thickness carefully before stepping onto frozen surfaces. Some pioneers relied on sleds instead of wagons during winter travel. Sleds glided more easily over snow and allowed transportation of firewood, supplies, or food between settlements. Horses or oxen pulled these sleds along narrow trails, packed by repeated use. Despite hardships, winter also offered unexpected advantages. Snow acted as insulation, covering crops left in the ground and protecting root vegetables from freezing completely. It also reduced insect activity and slowed the spread of certain plant diseases, improving conditions for spring planting. Faith played a strong role in frontier survival. Many families held religious gatherings inside cabins when travel to distant churches became impossible. Prayer offered comfort during uncertain times, especially when sickness or shortages threatened survival. As weeks passed, winter settled deeper into the frontier landscape. Snowdrifts grew taller, temperatures dropped further, and daily tasks demanded greater effort. Supplies stored during autumn slowly diminished, and settlers watched carefully to ensure their food and fuel would last until spring. The pioneers who endured these conditions did so through discipline, cooperation, and constant vigilance. Every task, from feeding animals to mending clothes, became part of a larger struggle against the cold. The lessons learned during these early weeks would prove essential as the season grew harsher and new dangers appeared.
By the time winter reached its deepest point, usually in January and February, the frontier entered its most dangerous phase. The excitement of early snowfall had faded, replaced by exhaustion and careful rationing. Supplies that once seemed plentiful began to shrink, and every decision carried greater importance. The harshest cold settled across the land, freezing rivers solid and turning forests into silent fields of white. One of the greatest fears during this period was running out of food. Even families that prepared well sometimes misjudged how long winter would last. Snowstorms could arrive late in the season, extending the cold for weeks beyond what settlers expected. In these moments, pioneers turned to emergency food sources that were often less desirable but still necessary for survival. Corn again proved to be the most reliable resource. Dried kernels stored in barrels could last many months when kept dry. Families carefully measured daily portions to prevent waste. Cornmeal mush became a common meal, eaten morning and night. Though simple, it provided energy that helped settlers endure cold temperatures and heavy labor. Root cellars became especially valuable as winter progressed. These underground storage spaces protected vegetables such as potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions from freezing completely. The earth surrounding the cellar kept temperatures steady, allowing food to remain usable long after harvest season ended. However, if the cellar flooded or froze too deeply, food could spoil quickly, leaving families with limited options. Hunting during the deepest winter months required skill and patience. Animals grew scarce as many migrated to lower ground or sheltered in dense forests. Deer, one of the most important sources of meat, became harder to track when snow grew deep enough to slow both hunter and prey. Still, experienced woodsmen learned to identify bedding areas where animals rested and feeding spots where bark or shrubs remained accessible. Small game often became more important than large animals. Rabbits, squirrels, and wild birds provided steady sources of protein. Trapping lines stretched across miles of forest, set carefully to increase chances of success. These traps were checked daily, regardless of weather conditions. Failing to check traps meant losing valuable fur and meat to scavengers. Winter also tested the durability of pioneer homes. Logs expanded and contracted with changing temperatures, sometimes creating gaps in cabin walls. Cold wind forced its way through these openings, lowering indoor temperatures and increasing discomfort. Settlers constantly repaired cracks using clay, mud, or moss, pressing the material tightly into openings to block drafts. Ice buildup created additional problems. Snow melting slightly during daytime could refreeze overnight, forming heavy layers along rooftops. If too much weight collected, roofs risked collapse. Families often climbed carefully onto roofs with wooden tools to remove heavy snow. This work required balance and caution, especially when surfaces became slippery. Inside the cabin, maintaining warmth required strict routines. Fires needed constant attention, especially overnight. Many pioneers slept lightly, waking several times to add wood to the flames. If the fire died completely, restarting it in freezing darkness could take precious time. Some families kept small embers alive beneath the ashes, allowing them to rekindle flames quickly when needed. Medical emergencies during deep winter were especially frightening. Cuts, burns, or broken bones could happen during routine chores. Without nearby doctors, settlers relied on practical remedies and knowledge passed from older generations. Herbal teas made from plants like mint or willow bark were used to treat fever or pain. Clean bandages were made from torn cloth, carefully washed and dried near the fire. Frostbite became a serious threat for anyone spending time outdoors. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were particularly vulnerable to freezing temperatures. Early signs included numbness and pale skin. Experienced pioneers recognized these symptoms quickly and warmed affected areas slowly near the fire. Rubbing frozen skin too aggressively could cause damage, so careful treatment was necessary. Winter storms sometimes forced settlers to remain indoors for days at a time. During these periods, boredom and tension could grow. Families shared limited space, and patience became as important as physical strength. Storytelling played a powerful role in maintaining morale. Older family members shared tales of earlier journeys, Native American encounters, or distant homelands left behind. Music also provided comfort. Simple instruments such as fiddles or flutes were treasured possessions. Songs passed down through generations filled the cabin during long nights, creating moments of warmth and connection despite the freezing world outside. Work never truly stopped, even during severe cold. Winter became a time for crafting and repair. Men carved wooden tools, repaired wagon wheels, or shaped handles for axes and shovels. Women focused on spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and sewing garments needed for future seasons. These indoor tasks ensured that spring would begin with necessary supplies ready. Children continued learning essential skills. Boys often practiced carving techniques, while girls learned sewing and cooking from their mothers. These lessons prepared young pioneers for adult responsibilities that would eventually fall upon them. Travel between settlements became rare during the coldest weeks, but when it occurred, it required careful preparation. Travelers packed extra blankets, food, and flint for starting fires. They studied landmarks such as large trees, rock formations, or river bends to guide their path. Snow-covered landscapes looked similar in every direction, making navigation difficult. Many pioneers relied on knowledge shared by Native American tribes who had lived in these regions for generations. Indigenous survival methods included building snow shelters, using animal skins effectively, and identifying winter food sources. These shared skills saved countless lives, especially among settlers unfamiliar with harsh northern climates. Wood remained the most valuable winter resource. As stored piles diminished, gathering more wood became increasingly dangerous. Snow buried fallen branches, and cutting standing trees required heavy labor. Yet without firewood, survival was impossible. Some families established rotating schedules to ensure wood supplies remained steady throughout the season. Water continued to present challenges. Wells often froze near the surface, requiring settlers to chip away ice daily. Carrying heavy buckets through snow demanded strength and balance. Spilled water could freeze instantly, turning paths into slippery hazards. Mental endurance became just as important as physical strength. The long darkness and constant cold created feelings of worry and fatigue. Settlers learned to focus on routine, completing small tasks one at a time to maintain a sense of control. Every completed chore, no matter how small, represented progress toward survival. Wild animals sometimes approached settlements more closely during deep winter. Wolves and other predators, driven by hunger, followed the scent of livestock or stored food. Families secured barns tightly and kept weapons nearby for protection. Nighttime howls echoing through frozen forests reminded settlers that danger remained beyond their cabin walls. As February approached, winter seemed endless. Snow lay thick across fields where crops once grew, and frozen rivers stretched like solid highways across the land. Yet beneath this harsh surface, small signs of change began to appear. Days slowly grew longer, sunlight lingered slightly later, and settlers began to think about the possibility of spring. Still, the most difficult weeks remained ahead. Supplies were at their lowest, fatigue was at its highest, and storms could strike without warning. Surviving this stage required careful management of every remaining resource. Those who endured these final weeks of deep winter would soon face a new challenge, the unpredictable transition between winter and spring.
As winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the frontier,
Pioneers entered a period that was both hopeful and dangerous. The first signs of melting snow brought relief, but they also created new hardships that tested survival in different ways. The frozen world that had once been solid and predictable now turned unstable, and settlers had to adapt quickly to changing conditions. During this transition from winter to early spring, water became both a blessing and a threat. Snow that had piled high for months began to melt during the day and refreeze at night. This cycle created thick layers of ice on trails, making travel treacherous. Horses and oxen often slipped, risking injury that could cripple a family's ability to work the land once planting season arrived. Flooding rivers became a major concern. Ice covering rivers and creeks weakened as temperatures rose, sometimes breaking apart suddenly. Large chunks of ice moved downstream, crashing into riverbanks and destroying bridges or small structures built too close to the water. Settlers living near rivers kept a careful watch, knowing that sudden flooding could wash away supplies or livestock in a matter of hours. Cabins that survived months of snow now faced the problem of leaking roofs. As ice melted, water seeped through cracks between wooden shingles. Families climbed onto roofs to repair damaged areas, replacing broken boards and sealing gaps with tar or clay. These repairs were necessary to prevent interior flooding that could ruin stored food and bedding. Mud quickly replaced snow across the frontier. Dirt paths that had been firm during frozen months turned into deep, sticky mud. Wagons became nearly useless, and even walking required great effort. Boots sank into the ground with each step, making simple tasks like carrying water or feeding animals slow and exhausting. Despite these difficulties, pioneers welcomed melting snow because it revealed hidden supplies buried during winter storms. Tools, firewood piles, and stored materials that had been lost beneath drifts slowly reappeared. These discoveries often brought relief, especially when families found items they had feared were permanently lost. Livestock required special care during this period. Animals weakened by months of limited food struggled to regain strength. Fresh grass had not yet grown, so settlers continued feeding remaining hay and grain carefully. Protecting animals from cold rain became just as important as shielding them from snow, since wet conditions could lead to sickness. Food supplies reached their lowest point during the early thaw. Hunting remained difficult, and fishing became unpredictable as river ice broke apart. Many families survived on their final stores of dried corn and root vegetables. Meals grew smaller, and hunger became a familiar feeling in many households. At the same time, pioneers began preparing for the planting season. Seeds stored during winter were inspected closely. Families checked for signs of mold or damage caused by rodents. Healthy seeds were placed in dry containers and kept safe until soil conditions allowed planting. Tool repair became one of the most important late winter activities. Plows, hoes, and axes that had been used heavily during previous seasons were sharpened and reinforced. Wooden handles were replaced if cracked, and metal blades were cleaned of rust. Having reliable tools ready for spring could determine whether crops succeeded or failed. Children remained active helpers during this period. They carried small bundles of firewood, gathered melting snow water, and helped clean storage areas. Learning responsibility at a young age continued to be a key part of frontier life. Each task, no matter how small, supported the survival of the entire family. The changing weather also affected health. Damp conditions increased the risk of illness, especially respiratory infections. Wet clothing chilled the body quickly, leading to fevers or pneumonia. Families worked hard to keep clothing dry by hanging garments near the fire and rotating blankets to prevent moisture buildup. Another challenge came from melting snow uncovering waste that had been buried during winter. Animal remains, spoiled food, and other debris sometimes created unpleasant odors and attracted scavengers. Settlers cleaned these areas carefully to prevent disease and maintain safe living conditions. The early thaw also created opportunities for gathering fresh food. As snow melted along riverbanks and forest edges, certain wild plants began to appear. Young shoots, roots, and early greens provided valuable nutrients that had been missing from winter diets. These fresh foods helped restore strength after months of preserved meals. Fishing improved slightly as rivers opened. Settlers built simple nets or used hooks and lines to catch fish moving through newly opened channels. Fresh fish became a welcome addition to meals, providing protein that helped rebuild weakened bodies. Travel between settlements gradually increased during this period. Neighbors who had been isolated for months finally reunited, sharing news and trading supplies. These meetings strengthened community bonds and allowed settlers to exchange valuable information about weather patterns, crop plans, and available resources. Trade became more active as well. Furs collected during winter were exchanged for tools, salt, or cloth. These trades helped families prepare for the coming growing season. Some settlers traveled long distances to reach trading posts, navigating muddy trails and swollen rivers along the way. Spring storms remained a constant threat. Heavy rain sometimes replaced snow, causing sudden flooding that damaged fields and washed away fences. Settlers worked quickly to repair barriers that protected livestock and marked property boundaries. Emotionally, this period brought mixed feelings. Relief from extreme cold combined with anxiety about upcoming work. The survival focus of winter shifted towards preparation for growth. Families knew that success during spring planting would determine their survival during the next winter. Daily routines became busier as daylight hours increased. Tasks that had been postponed during the cold months now demanded attention. Clearing fallen branches, repairing fences, and organizing tools filled every available hour. Cabin interiors also required cleaning after months of heavy use. Smoke residue from fireplaces coated walls and ceilings, and bedding needed fresh airing. Families opened doors and windows when weather allowed, letting fresh air circulate through living spaces. Animals showed signs of renewed energy as temperatures rose slightly. Chickens laid eggs more regularly, providing a fresh source of food after months of relying on stored supplies. Cows that survived winter began producing milk again, offering valuable nutrition for children and adults alike. Despite these signs of recovery, pioneers remained cautious. Experience taught them that winter's final storms could still arrive without warning. Many settlers kept firewood supplies stocked and food reserves protected, knowing that sudden cold snaps could return even as spring approached. As the snow continued to melt and muddy ground spread across the frontier, pioneers prepared for one of the most demanding periods of the year. The struggle to survive winter was slowly ending, but the work required to rebuild strength and prepare fields had only just begun. The coming weeks would test endurance in new ways as settlers faced the challenge of transforming frozen land into fertile soil once again.
As the cold months stretched into late winter, pioneers faced one of the most uncertain and exhausting times of the year. This period, often called the late winter hunger, tested the limits of both supplies and endurance. By February and early March, many families had already consumed most of their preserved foods. Barrels that once felt heavy were now nearly empty, and careful rationing became stricter than ever before. Late winter was dangerous because it created a false sense of hope. The sun stayed in the sky slightly longer each day, and melting snow during warmer afternoons suggested that spring might arrive soon. But experienced pioneers knew that this period could be the harshest of all. Sudden cold snaps often followed mild days, refreezing melted snow into hard ice and creating treacherous walking conditions. Food shortages became the most pressing concern during this time. Even well-prepared families sometimes miscalculated their needs. When supplies ran low, settlers turned to creative survival methods. Cornmeal was stretched by mixing it with ground acorns or dried roots. Though bitter in taste, these additions helped extend precious food reserves. Wild plants also played an important role when stored food dwindled. Pioneers gathered bark from certain trees, especially inner bark layers that could be boiled and softened into edible material. This was not a preferred meal, but in times of shortage, it could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Knowledge of edible plants was often passed from Native American communities to settlers, helping them recognize safe sources of nourishment. Fishing became another valuable option once ice began to thin. Using axes or iron tools, pioneers cut holes into frozen lakes and rivers. Lines baited with scraps of meat were lowered into dark water below. Ice fishing required patience, but it provided fresh protein at a time when hunting success declined. The physical strength of settlers often weakened by late winter. Months of hard labor combined with reduced food intake led to fatigue and weight loss. Heavy clothing felt harder to carry, and simple tasks required more effort. Yet work could not stop. Firewood still needed cutting, water had to be collected, and animals required daily care. Livestock survival became especially difficult during late winter. Stored hay supplies were often nearly gone, and animals grew thinner with each passing week. Some settlers resorted to feeding livestock dried leaves or ground corn husks to stretch feed supplies. Losing animals at this stage was devastating, as they represented future food, labor, and income. Weather during late winter remained unpredictable. Storms arriving in February or March could be just as fierce as those in December. Heavy snowfall buried roads again, undoing weeks of slow melting. Wind-driven snow piled into drifts that blocked doorways and covered pathways between buildings. Maintaining access to outdoor structures became a daily chore. Settlers shoveled snow away from barns, smokehouses, and storage sheds to prevent collapse under heavy weight. Roofs covered in packed snow required careful clearing, especially after storms that brought wet, heavy snowfall. The added weight threatened weak beams and fragile structures. Inside the cabin, clothing repair became constant work. Months of use caused wear and tear that could not be ignored. Torn sleeves, worn boots, and frayed blankets needed immediate attention. Without repair, these items would fail completely, leaving settlers exposed to freezing air. Soap making often took place during this time. Cleanliness played an important role in preventing illness, even under harsh conditions. Soap was made from animal fat mixed with lye, which came from wood ashes. The process required careful handling, but the result allowed families to wash clothing and maintain basic hygiene. Winter illnesses often peaked during late winter. After months of close indoor living, diseases spread easily among family members. Coughs, fevers, and infections were common, especially among children and elderly settlers. Limited medicine meant families relied heavily on herbal remedies and simple treatments like warm broths and rest. Mental strain became more noticeable during these weeks. The long months of isolation weighed heavily on settlers. Anxiety grew as supplies dwindled, and uncertainty about the future created tension within families. To cope, pioneers relied on routines and traditions that brought comfort. Storytelling remained a powerful form of relief. Many stories focused on past journeys, memories of earlier homes, or hopeful dreams of fertile land in the coming spring. These moments reminded families of their purpose and strengthened their determination to endure. Religious gatherings, even small ones, played an important role in maintaining morale. When weather allowed, neighbors sometimes gathered inside a larger cabin for prayer and shared meals. These rare social events lifted spirits and reinforced community bonds that were essential to survival. Children continued learning through observation and participation. They watched adults ration food, repair tools, and prepare emergency meals. These experiences taught responsibility and resilience from an early age. Winter was not only a season of survival, but also a period of education for the next generation. Wildlife behavior changed noticeably during late winter. Animals that had remained hidden earlier in the season became more visible as they searched for food. Deer moved closer to settlements, feeding on exposed branches or leftover crops. Hunters watched carefully for these opportunities, knowing that a single successful hunt could supply meat for many days. Predators also grew bolder during this time. Wolves and other carnivores followed prey animals toward human settlements. Nighttime sounds of distant howls reminded settlers that danger remained near. Protecting livestock required constant vigilance, especially during dark hours. Transportation slowly improved as snow hardened into packed trails. Sleds became useful for moving supplies between cabins or transporting firewood from distant areas. These trails often followed earlier wagon paths, marked by years of repeated use. Despite exhaustion and hardship, settlers began preparing for the future even before winter ended. Seeds saved from previous harvests were sorted and checked for damage. Farming tools were inspected and repaired, ensuring they would be ready when soil finally thawed. Late winter also became a time of planning. Families discussed planting strategies, livestock care, and building improvements for the coming year. Surviving winter was not the final goal. Thriving during the next growing season depended on lessons learned during the cold months. As March approached, sunlight returned with greater strength. Icicles formed along roof edges, dripping slowly during warm afternoons. Patches of dark earth began to appear where snow melted away. These signs of change lifted spirits, but experienced pioneers remained cautious. Spring on the frontier did not arrive gently. It often came with flooding rivers, muddy trails, and unpredictable storms. The shift from frozen ground to thawing earth created new challenges that required fresh strategies for survival. For the pioneers who endured late winter, the approaching thaw marked both relief and danger. Their supplies were low, their bodies tired, yet hope slowly returned. The lessons learned through months of hardship prepared them for the next stage of frontier life, the difficult transition from frozen wilderness to muddy, unpredictable spring.
As the final grip of winter weakened and early spring began to settle across the frontier, pioneers shifted their focus from survival alone to recovery and rebuilding. The months of cold had left deep marks on cabins, livestock, tools, and human strength. Every family understood that what they did during these weeks would shape the success of the entire year ahead. The first major task was clearing the land of winter damage. Snow that had piled high for months melted into streams that carried branches, stones, and debris across fields. Fallen trees blocked pathways and crushed fences. Men and older boys worked for hours cutting away damaged wood, dragging heavy logs aside to reopen trails and prepare fields for planting. Fences were especially important to repair quickly. During winter, heavy snow sometimes knocked down rails, allowing animals to wander into places where they did not belong. Once snow melted, livestock needed secure boundaries to keep them from damaging young crops. Settlers rebuilt fence lines using split rails stacked in zigzag patterns, a method that required no nails but offered strong protection. Fields that had once been buried beneath snow now revealed frozen ground mixed with thick mud. Preparing soil for planting demanded strength and patience. Pioneers used iron-tipped plows pulled by oxen or horses to break apart hardened earth. The first passes through the soil were slow and difficult, as frost beneath the surface resisted movement. Oxen became especially valuable during this time. Unlike horses, oxen moved slowly but steadily, capable of pulling heavy loads through muddy ground. Many families depended on these animals to prepare fields before spring planting could begin. Protecting oxen through winter had been a priority, and now their strength proved essential. Women focused on restoring household supplies that had been heavily used during winter. Cooking tools were cleaned, storage containers inspected, and leftover food supplies sorted carefully. Anything spoiled or damaged was removed to prevent sickness. New containers were prepared to hold fresh harvests that would come later in the year. Gardens near cabins became early planting areas. As soon as the soil softened enough, settlers planted hardy crops such as onions, peas, and cabbage. These vegetables grew well in cooler weather and provided fresh food before larger crops matured. Early harvests reduced pressure on remaining winter supplies. Children played a major role in gathering natural materials uncovered by melting snow. They collected sticks for kindling, gathered stones for repairs, and helped locate tools that had been buried during winter storms. Their sharp eyes often found lost items hidden beneath layers of mud and debris. Spring water runoff created both opportunities and risks. Small streams formed where melting snow flowed downhill. Settlers sometimes redirected this water to irrigate fields or supply livestock. However, uncontrolled water could flood low areas and damage crops before they had time to grow. Careful planning allowed pioneers to take advantage of water without suffering losses. Cabins that had sheltered families through winter required inspection from roof to foundation. Wooden logs sometimes rotted or cracked due to moisture and freezing temperatures. Settlers replaced damaged sections with fresh timber, sealing gaps again with mud or clay. Chimneys also needed careful checking, as shifting stones could create fire hazards. Firewood remained necessary even as temperatures warmed. Cool nights still required steady heat, and sudden cold spells could return without warning. Families continued gathering and stacking wood, though not at the same desperate pace as during deep winter. Wildlife activity increased noticeably during early spring. Animals that had remained hidden during winter became more visible as they searched for food. Deer returned to open fields, feeding on fresh growth. This created new hunting opportunities, allowing families to restock food supplies that had nearly disappeared. Fishing improved as rivers cleared completely of ice. Fresh fish became more abundant, offering valuable protein that helped restore strength after months of limited diets. Settlers used simple wooden poles, woven nets, or handmade traps placed along riverbanks. Livestock health slowly improved as conditions changed. Animals began grazing on early patches of grass that pushed through melting snow. Though these patches were small at first, they provided relief from stored feed that had nearly run out. Stronger animals meant better farming power and more reliable food sources. Community cooperation grew stronger during this period. Neighbors gathered to help one another repair barns, rebuild fences, or prepare large fields. These group efforts, sometimes called work gatherings, allowed families to accomplish tasks that would have been impossible alone. Shared meals often followed these work gatherings. Though food supplies remained limited, families combined resources to create simple but satisfying meals. These moments strengthened friendships and built trust among settlers who depended on one another for survival. Transportation slowly returned as roads began drying. Wagons replaced sleds once snow disappeared. However, muddy trails still caused delays, and travel remained slow. Settlers carefully selected travel days based on weather conditions to avoid becoming stuck in deep mud. Medical care continued to challenge pioneer families. Illnesses that began during winter sometimes lingered into spring. Weak immune systems made recovery slow, especially among elderly settlers. Fresh air, sunlight, and improved diets helped speed healing, but patience remained necessary. Spring also brought insects back to the frontier. Mosquitoes and flies emerged from melted wetlands, creating new discomforts. Though not as dangerous as winter cold, these pests spread irritation and sometimes disease. Settlers protected food and water supplies carefully to avoid contamination. Mental recovery from winter hardships took time. Months of darkness and cold left emotional strain that did not disappear immediately. Yet the return of sunlight and outdoor activity improved morale. Working under open skies brought renewed energy and hope. Preparation for large-scale planting became the primary focus as soil conditions improved. Corn remained the most important crop, along with beans and squash. These crops formed the backbone of pioneer diets and could be stored for long periods once harvested. Seeds were planted carefully in rows, spaced to allow proper growth. Families worked long hours bending over fields, pressing seeds into freshly turned soil. Each seed represented hope for survival during the next winter. As spring strengthened, pioneers reflected on lessons learned during the cold months. They remembered which foods lasted longest, which tools broke under pressure, and which methods proved most effective. These lessons shaped decisions that would influence the future of their families and communities. The frontier remained unpredictable, but pioneers who survived winter gained confidence in their ability to face new challenges. Their strength did not come from comfort, but from experience. Each hardship endured made them more capable of handling the demands of frontier life. Though winter had finally begun to fade, its effects remained visible everywhere. Fields bore scars from storms, cabins showed signs of wear, and families carried memories of difficult nights spent fighting cold and hunger. Yet beneath these marks of hardship lay determination to move forward. As spring settled more firmly across the frontier, pioneers entered a season of rebuilding strength and restoring what winter had taken away. The struggle to survive the cold months had left families physically weakened, supplies nearly exhausted, and tools worn from constant use. Yet this was also a time of determination, when settlers worked tirelessly to prepare for the next winter long before it arrived. Planting season became the center of daily life. After months of snow and ice, the appearance of workable soil felt like a victory. Families rose early each morning to begin preparing fields. The ground, once frozen solid, now softened enough to allow plows to break through its surface. This work was slow and exhausting, but every turned row brought them closer to securing food for the future. Corn remained the most essential crop for frontier survival. It grew well in many types of soil and provided a reliable food source that could be dried and stored for winter. Pioneers planted corn in carefully spaced hills, placing several seeds in each mound. Beans were often planted alongside corn, allowing vines to climb the tall stalks as they grew. Squash was added between rows, spreading along the ground and helping protect soil moisture. This planting method, sometimes called companion planting, improved harvest success. The importance of a successful harvest weighed heavily on every settler. Memories of winter hunger remained fresh, reminding families of how close they had come to starvation. Each seed placed into the ground represented not only food, but security against future hardship. Water management became another critical task. Melting snow had filled streams and rivers, sometimes causing flooding in low-lying areas. Settlers dug shallow trenches to direct excess water away from planted fields. Without these efforts, heavy rain or runoff could wash away seeds before they had time to grow. Gardens near cabins produced the first signs of recovery. Early vegetables such as lettuce, onions, and peas sprouted quickly, offering fresh food after months of preserved meals. These small harvests brought relief to families who had lived on limited rations throughout winter. Livestock care also demanded careful attention. Animals that survived winter often needed time to regain strength. Fresh grass began to grow across open fields, allowing cows, sheep, and horses to graze naturally. This reduced the need for stored feed, which had been nearly depleted during late winter. Cows resumed regular milk production as their health improved. Milk became an important source of nutrition, especially for children. Women used milk to produce butter and simple cheeses, preserving dairy products for future use. These tasks required skill and patience, but they added valuable variety to pioneer diets. Chickens, which had laid fewer eggs during cold months, began producing more consistently as daylight increased. Eggs provided an excellent source of protein and could be eaten fresh or preserved in certain ways to extend their usefulness. The return of warmer weather allowed repairs that had been impossible during winter. Barn roofs damaged by heavy snow were rebuilt, and broken wagon wheels were repaired or replaced. Cabins received fresh coats of mud and clay along their walls to strengthen insulation before the next cold season. Community cooperation continued to play an important role. Large tasks such as clearing forests or building new structures often required the strength of multiple families working together. These cooperative events created strong bonds among settlers and reinforced the importance of unity on the frontier. While adults handled heavy labor, children learned practical skills that prepared them for adult life. Boys practiced handling tools like axes and hoes under supervision, while girls learned cooking, sewing, and preserving food. Education on the frontier did not always occur in classrooms. Instead, knowledge passed through daily work and observation. Wildlife returned in greater numbers as forests awakened from winter. Birds filled the air with calls, and small animals moved through newly grown grass. Hunters took advantage of these changes, bringing home fresh meat that improved family meals. Deer and wild turkeys were among the most valuable sources of protein. Fishing also became more productive as rivers settled after winter flooding. Settlers placed nets in shallow waters or used hooks baited with insects or worms found in moist soil. Fresh fish, combined with early vegetables, marked the gradual end of winter scarcity. Despite improvements, pioneers never forgot the lessons learned during cold months. They began storing supplies early, determined not to repeat mistakes that had nearly cost them their lives. New firewood piles were started even in warm weather, cut and stacked in preparation for the next winter. Food preservation became a major focus long before harvest season arrived. Women gathered herbs and early plants that could be dried and stored. Meat from hunting was salted or smoked, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Every preserved item added to future security. Weather remained unpredictable even during spring. Sudden cold spells sometimes returned, damaging young crops and reminding settlers that winter could still deliver unexpected challenges. Families protected delicate plants with coverings made from cloth or straw when frost threatened. Medical concerns continued to demand attention. After months of limited nutrition, many settlers suffered weakness or illness. Fresh vegetables and sunlight gradually improved health, but recovery required time. Herbal remedies remained common, made from plants gathered in nearby forests and fields. The emotional recovery from winter hardships became noticeable as families spent more time outdoors. Children played freely in open spaces, while adults found relief in the rhythm of planting and building. The sound of birds and flowing water replaced the silence of frozen landscapes. Trade between settlements increased as roads improved. Wagons carried furs collected during winter to trading posts, where they were exchanged for tools, cloth, salt, and other essential items. These trades allowed families to replace worn equipment and prepare for the future. Settlers also began planning long-term improvements to their land. Some cleared additional forest areas to expand fields, while others built larger storage spaces to hold next winter's supplies. These improvements reflected growing confidence gained through survival experience. As crops began sprouting across the fields, pioneers watched carefully for signs of healthy growth. Green shoots pushing through soil symbolized hope and renewal. Yet alongside hope remained caution. Families understood that true safety would not come until harvest season filled storage barrels once again. The lessons learned from winter survival remained deeply rooted in pioneer life. Every repaired fence, every planted seed, and every stacked log represented preparation for the next cold season. The memory of hunger and isolation shaped every decision made during this time. While spring brought energy and recovery, it also reminded settlers that the frontier demanded constant readiness. Success did not come from a single season of work, but from careful planning carried out throughout the entire year. As fields grew greener and animals regained strength, pioneers slowly moved from survival mode toward rebuilding their future. The long winter had tested their endurance, but the coming months would determine whether they could transform hardship into lasting stability.
As spring deepened and the land slowly recovered from winter's harsh grip, pioneers entered a season of rebuilding strength and preparing for the long-term security that winter survival demanded. Though the worst cold had passed, memories of hunger and freezing nights remained sharp in their minds. Every action taken during these warmer weeks was guided by the knowledge that another winter would eventually return. By late spring, fields that had once been frozen solid began showing strong signs of growth. Rows of corn pushed steadily upward, their green stalks stretching toward sunlight. Beans wrapped themselves around corn stalks, while squash spread wide leaves across the ground. These crops formed the backbone of pioneer agriculture, providing food that could be eaten fresh or preserved for the next winter. Weeding became one of the most time-consuming daily tasks. Wild plants competed with crops for nutrients and water, threatening the success of carefully planted fields. Families spent long hours bent over the soil, pulling weeds by hand. Even young children joined in this work, learning to recognize harmful plants and remove them before they spread. Rainfall played a crucial role during this time. Moderate rain supported healthy crop growth, but heavy storms created new dangers. Sudden downpours sometimes flooded fields, washing away seeds or damaging fragile young plants. Settlers watched the skies closely, reading cloud patterns and wind direction to predict approaching storms. Protecting crops from animals became another challenge. Deer, rabbits, and birds were drawn to fresh greenery. Fences built earlier in the season helped keep larger animals away, but smaller creatures often slipped through gaps. Settlers used scarecrows, noise-making tools, and constant watchfulness to protect valuable crops. Food supplies slowly improved as early harvests reached the kitchen. Fresh vegetables replaced dried winter rations, bringing much-needed variety to meals. The taste of newly grown food lifted spirits and restored strength after months of limited nutrition. Preserving food for the next winter became a top priority even before the full harvest season arrived. Women led much of this work, using traditional methods passed down through generations. Vegetables were sliced and laid out to dry in sunlight. Herbs were tied into bundles and hung inside cabins where warm air circulated. Smokehouses played a central role in preserving meat. Freshly hunted animals were cut into strips and hung above slow-burning fires. The smoke removed moisture from the meat, allowing it to last for months without spoiling. Salt was often added to enhance preservation, making each piece more resistant to decay.
Fishing remained productive as rivers stabilized after spring floods. Settlers developed routines for setting nets early in the morning and collecting them later in the day. Fish caught in large numbers were smoked or dried to create long-lasting food supplies. As the land grew greener, livestock regained strength and produced more resources for families. Sheep provided wool, which was cleaned, spun, and woven into cloth. Wool production became especially important because strong clothing prepared during summer offered protection during winter. Cows supplied milk daily, and butter making became a regular task. Butter could be stored for later use or traded with nearby settlers. The return of dairy products added richness to meals that had once been limited to simple grains and preserved meats. Summer clothing preparation began during this time as well. Lightweight garments were sewn for warm weather, while heavier clothing repairs continued in anticipation of colder months ahead. Sewing remained a steady task throughout the year as clothing wore out quickly under frontier conditions. Timber cutting resumed as forests dried from melting snow. Settlers gathered wood not only for immediate needs, but also for winter storage. Trees were cut and split months before cold weather returned, allowing wood to dry properly. Dry wood burned more efficiently and produced greater heat during freezing nights. Cabin improvements continued steadily. Some families expanded their homes, adding extra rooms or loft spaces for storage. These additions allowed better organization of food and supplies, reducing the risk of loss during future winters. Community life became more active as travel conditions improved. Settlers gathered for social events such as barn raisings, where neighbors worked together to construct new buildings. These gatherings combined hard labor with shared meals, strengthening relationships between families. Trade routes became busier as settlers transported goods to distant markets. Furs collected during winter, preserved meats, and woven cloth were exchanged for iron tools, salt, and other essential items. These trades connected isolated communities to wider networks of commerce. Education for children continued, often during evening hours after fieldwork ended. Reading and writing lessons took place by candlelight, using limited books that were carefully preserved. Knowledge gained during these lessons prepared children to handle responsibilities in adulthood. Weather remained unpredictable even as summer approached. Late frosts sometimes damaged crops, forcing settlers to replant certain fields. Such setbacks reminded families that survival depended on persistence and careful planning rather than luck alone. Wildlife remained an important source of food and trade materials. Hunters tracked animals through forests that were now easier to navigate without deep snow. Skins collected during this period were cleaned and stored for trading later in the year. Water systems also improved during late spring. Wells that had frozen during winter returned to full use, reducing the need to collect water from distant streams. Reliable water supplies made daily chores more efficient and improved sanitation. Sanitation became increasingly important as temperatures warmed. Waste disposal areas were cleaned, and food storage locations were inspected for contamination. Keeping living areas clean reduced the spread of disease, which had been common during crowded winter months. Mental recovery from winter hardship became more noticeable during this period. Laughter returned to cabins, and outdoor gatherings created opportunities for storytelling and shared experiences. Children played freely in open spaces, enjoying the warmth that had been absent for months. Despite these improvements, settlers remained focused on long-term preparation. Every successful day of planting, harvesting, and preserving moved them closer to surviving the next winter. The memory of cold winds and empty food barrels remained powerful motivation. By the end of this stage, the frontier landscape had transformed completely. Snow-covered ground was replaced by fertile soil, and frozen rivers flowed freely once again. The wilderness that had once threatened survival now provided the resources needed for recovery.
Yet pioneers understood that comfort was temporary. The cycle of seasons continued without pause, and the next winter would arrive sooner than expected. The work done during these warmer months would determine whether future winters brought security or hardship. As crops grew taller and storage areas began filling once more, settlers prepared for the next crucial phase, the peak harvest season, when the success of their efforts would finally be measured.
As summer reached its peak across the frontier, pioneers entered one of the most demanding and important times of the year. The months of planting and careful tending now led toward the harvest season, when the success of their survival efforts would be measured. Every hour of daylight was used wisely because settlers understood that the food gathered during this period would determine how well they survived the coming winter. Fields that had once been bare and frozen now stood tall with growing crops. Corn stalks reached above waist height, their leaves rustling in warm breezes. Beans climbed steadily along the corn, and squash vines spread across the soil, shading the ground and helping retain moisture. These crops worked together to support each other, providing a reliable supply of food that could last throughout the year. Harvesting early crops began first. Vegetables such as peas, onions, and cabbage were gathered and carried back to cabins in woven baskets. Families worked together to remove these plants carefully, making room for later harvests while providing fresh meals during the warm months. Food preservation became the main focus as harvest activities increased. Drying racks were placed outside cabins where sliced fruits and vegetables were spread across wooden boards or cloth. The sun and warm air slowly removed moisture, allowing food to be stored for long periods without spoiling. Corn harvesting required careful timing. Settlers waited until ears matured fully before picking them from tall stalks. Once gathered, corn was husked by hand and hung in bunches to dry. Drying corn properly ensured it could be ground into meal during winter months, forming the foundation of daily meals. Apples and berries collected from nearby orchards and forests added variety to pioneer diets. Fruits were dried, pressed into cakes, or boiled into preserves that could be stored in sealed containers. These preserved foods provided valuable nutrients during winter when fresh produce was unavailable. Meat preservation also increased during this season. Hunting remained active, with settlers taking advantage of abundant wildlife. Deer, wild turkeys, and smaller animals were cleaned, salted, and smoked to create supplies that would last through the cold months ahead. Smokehouses operated almost constantly during peak harvest season. Fires burned slowly beneath hanging strips of meat, producing steady smoke that removed moisture. Salted and smoked meat became one of the most valuable winter resources, especially when hunting conditions became difficult. Grain storage required careful planning. Corn and other grains were placed in secure containers to protect them from moisture and pests. Rodents posed a constant threat, capable of destroying entire food supplies if left unchecked. Settlers stored grain in elevated bins or tightly sealed barrels to prevent contamination. While food preservation dominated daily routines, other tasks remained equally important. Firewood collection continued throughout summer. Trees cut earlier in the season were split into smaller pieces and stacked in long rows. These stacks were positioned where sunlight and air could dry them thoroughly before winter returned. Building projects often took place during this period as well. Families constructed additional storage sheds to hold growing food supplies. Barn expansions allowed more space for livestock, ensuring animals could be sheltered safely during cold weather. Children played an active role in harvest work. Younger children gathered fallen vegetables, collected berries, and helped spread food for drying. Older children assisted with heavier tasks such as carrying baskets or stacking firewood. Their participation strengthened family survival efforts and taught valuable skills. Weather remained a constant factor in harvest success. Too much rain could damage crops, while long dry periods threatened growth.
Settlers watched the sky carefully, relying on experience to predict changes in weather patterns. Thunderstorms sometimes arrived suddenly, bringing heavy winds that flattened tall crops like corn. After such storms, families hurried into fields to lift fallen stalks and secure damaged plants. Quick action often saved crops that would otherwise be lost. Livestock care remained steady during harvest season. Animals required fresh water, grazing space, and protection from predators. Chickens laid eggs regularly, providing an ongoing source of food. Sheep were sheared for wool, which was cleaned and prepared for weaving. Wool processing became an important activity during summer months. After shearing sheep, families washed wool thoroughly to remove dirt and oils. Once dried, the wool was spun into yarn using hand spindles or spinning wheels. This yarn later became warm clothing needed during winter. Trade activity increased during this time as settlers transported goods to nearby markets or trading posts. Surplus crops, preserved foods, and animal skins were exchanged for iron tools, salt, and cloth materials that were difficult to produce locally. Community gatherings often centered around harvest work. Large tasks such as corn husking were completed through cooperative efforts. Neighbors gathered to help one another, turning heavy labor into social events filled with conversation and shared meals. These gatherings strengthened bonds between families and ensured that no one faced winter alone. Cooperation had proven essential during past winters, and settlers continued to support one another whenever possible. Water storage also became part of preparation for colder months. Rainwater collected in barrels provided backup supplies in case wells froze again during winter. Maintaining access to clean water remained a critical survival factor. Medical supplies were restocked as herbs and plants reached full growth. Settlers collected leaves, roots, and flowers known for healing properties. These plants were dried carefully and stored in sealed containers for use during illness or injury. Summer evenings brought moments of rest after long days of work. Families gathered outside cabins, enjoying cooler air as the sun set behind distant hills. Stories were shared and plans were discussed for remaining harvest tasks. Despite the warmth and activity of summer, settlers never forgot the hardships of winter. Every preserved jar, every stacked log, and every repaired fence represented protection against future cold. The lessons learned during past winters shaped every decision made during this busy season. As the weeks passed, storage areas filled steadily with dried food and preserved meat. The only empty shelves that had worried families during late winter now showed signs of security returning. Yet the work was far from finished. Soon, the largest harvests of the year would begin. Fields heavy with mature crops would require constant attention, and settlers would race against time to gather every possible resource before autumn winds signaled the approach of another winter.
As late summer faded into early autumn, pioneers entered the most critical preparation period of the entire year. This was the season when survival for the coming winter was truly secured or placed at risk. The days remained warm, but cool nights signaled that winter was approaching once again. Every settler understood that time was limited, and the success of their efforts during these weeks would determine whether their families faced comfort or hardship during the cold months ahead. Harvest season reached its peak during early autumn. Fields that had grown steadily through spring and summer now produced their largest yields. Corn stalks stood tall and heavy, with mature ears ready to be gathered. Families moved into the fields at sunrise and worked until sunset, collecting crops as quickly as possible before frost arrived. Corn harvesting required long hours of careful work. Each ear was pulled from the stalk by hand and placed into baskets or wagons. After being carried back to the homestead, the husks were removed and the corn was hung or spread out to dry completely.
Proper drying was essential because even slight moisture could cause mold, destroying valuable food supplies. Beans were harvested shortly after corn. Once dried on the vine, they were gathered and shelled, with the beans stored in cloth sacks or wooden containers. These beans provided a dependable source of protein that lasted through winter when fresh meat became scarce. Squash and pumpkins were also collected during this period. Their thick skins allowed them to be stored for long periods without spoiling. Settlers stacked these vegetables carefully in cool, dry spaces, often inside root cellars dug beneath cabins or nearby hillsides. Root crops such as potatoes, carrots, and turnips required special attention. Settlers dug them carefully from the soil, shaking off dirt before placing them into baskets. Once stored in root cellars, these vegetables remained edible for many months, providing important nourishment during winter when other crops were no longer available. Fruit harvesting became another major activity. Apples were among the most valuable fruits grown by settlers. They could be eaten fresh, dried, or pressed into cider. Dried apple slices became a favorite winter food, offering sweetness during long months of limited meals. Cider production provided both drinkable liquid and preserved food. Apples were crushed and pressed to extract juice, which could be stored or fermented. This process created beverages that lasted longer than fresh water stored in barrels, which sometimes froze during winter. Preserving food took place alongside harvesting. Large kettles were placed over outdoor fires to boil fruits into thick preserves. Vegetables were sliced thin and placed in the sun to dry. Every available space around the homestead filled with racks holding drying food. Meat preservation increased sharply during this time. Livestock that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered before cold weather arrived. This decision required careful planning because animals represented valuable resources. Meat from slaughtered animals was salted, smoked, and stored to ensure it remained usable throughout winter. Smokehouses worked day and night during this season. Fires burned slowly, producing smoke that dried meat strips hanging above. Salted pork, beef, and venison filled storage shelves, providing essential nutrition during months when hunting success might be limited. Wood gathering became an even greater priority as autumn progressed. Families cut and split wood in large quantities, building tall stacks near cabins and barns. Experienced settlers knew that underestimating wood needs could lead to freezing nights or forced travel during dangerous storms. Wood was stacked carefully to allow airflow between pieces, helping it dry fully before winter. Wet wood burned poorly and produced little heat, so preparation months in advance was necessary. Some families built simple shelters over wood piles to protect them from rain and snow. Clothing preparation also increased during autumn. Wool spun during summer was woven into fabric and sewn into coats, blankets, and mittens. Buckskin garments were repaired and reinforced, ensuring protection against freezing winds. Families inspected every item carefully, replacing worn pieces before winter returned. Footwear received special attention because cold feet created serious health risks. Leather boots were cleaned and treated with oils to keep them flexible and waterproof. Thick wool socks were knitted to provide insulation during outdoor work in freezing temperatures. Barns and shelters were strengthened before winter arrived. Settlers checked roofs, reinforced walls, and sealed openings where wind might enter. These improvements protected livestock from harsh weather and prevented loss of valuable animals. Fencing repairs continued as well. Strong fences kept livestock secure during winter, preventing animals from wandering into dangerous areas or damaging stored supplies. Every broken rail was replaced before heavy snow could hide weak spots. Transportation preparations took place during this period as well. Wagons were inspected and repaired in case emergency travel became necessary. Sleds were built or repaired for use once snow covered the ground. Having reliable transportation during winter could mean the difference between obtaining supplies or facing isolation. Community cooperation remained strong during autumn. Large harvests often required help from neighbors, especially when frost threatened to damage crops. Families worked together to gather remaining produce quickly, sharing tools and labor to protect one another's supplies. Shared meals followed long days of harvest work. Though simple, these meals celebrated the results of months of effort. Settlers felt relief as storage spaces filled with preserved food and stacked wood firewood. Weather patterns during autumn demanded close observation. Early frosts sometimes arrived without warning, damaging crops that had not yet been harvested. When frost threatened, settlers worked late into the night, gathering whatever remained in the fields. Hunting also increased during autumn. Animals prepared for winter by feeding heavily, making them easier to find. This created opportunities to collect fresh meat and valuable furs. Hunters used knowledge gained from previous seasons to track animals effectively. Fur preparation became another key activity. Skins were cleaned, stretched, and dried to prevent decay. These furs served as both clothing material and valuable trade items. Mental preparation played an important role during this stage. Memories of past winters encouraged careful planning. Settlers reviewed their storage areas, counting supplies and identifying any shortages that needed to be addressed immediately. Even children understood the seriousness of this season. They gathered small branches, collected fallen crops, and helped organize storage areas. Their participation made daily work more efficient and taught lessons that would guide them in adulthood. As autumn winds grew stronger and leaves changed color, the signs of approaching winter became impossible to ignore. Nights turned colder, and frost appeared more frequently on the ground. Settlers hurried to finish final tasks, knowing that snow could arrive at any time. By the end of this stage, homesteads looked very different from the nearly empty storage areas of early spring. Shelves filled with dried food, barns held protected animals, and tall stacks and wood firewood stood ready for the long, cold months ahead. Still, experienced pioneers understood that preparation alone did not guarantee safety. Winter always brought surprises, and only those who remained alert and disciplined would survive its harshest storms.
As autumn gave way to the first hints of winter, pioneers entered the final phase of preparation before the harsh cold returned. The months of planting, harvesting, and preserving food now culminated in securing homes, livestock, and supplies for survival. Every family understood that failure to complete these tasks could mean hardship, or worse, once snow and ice covered the land again. The first priority was ensuring that food storage was complete. Dried vegetables, salted meat, and preserved fruits were carefully inspected for signs of spoilage. Barrels were sealed, sacks tied tightly, and containers moved to protected areas within cabins or root cellars. Settlers knew that even a small loss could leave them vulnerable during long winter months. Root cellars became central to survival strategy. Dug deep into the ground or hillside, these cool, dark spaces kept food at stable temperatures, preventing spoilage. Vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, and turnips were layered in straw or sand to maintain freshness. Corn and beans were stored in elevated racks to protect them from rodents. These cellars became lifelines when snow covered the landscape. Livestock preparations intensified. Animals were fed the last of summer hay, and additional feed was stored nearby for winter. Pioneers constructed windbreaks around barns and paddocks, using logs, brush, and fences to shield animals from freezing winds. Water sources were insulated or heated when possible, as ice could prevent access to drinking water for days at a time. Barns and cabins received final repairs. Roofs were checked for loose shingles, and gaps in walls were filled with mud, clay, or moss.
Chimneys were cleared of soot to ensure safe and efficient fires. Every structural improvement increased the likelihood of survival during harsh storms. Firewood became the centerpiece of winter preparation. Families cut, split, and stacked enough wood to last for months, arranging it near fireplaces and stoves for easy access. Settlers understood that inadequate firewood meant exposure to freezing temperatures, illness, and even death. Clothing and bedding were also prioritized. Wool garments and blankets were inspected for holes and repaired before temperatures dropped. Mittens, hats, and socks were layered to provide maximum insulation. Leather boots were treated with oils to remain flexible, protecting feet from cold and wet conditions. Preparing clothing well in advance was a lesson learned from harsh winters past. Hunting and fishing were the final opportunities to gather food for the season. Wildlife moved closer to settlements as frost approached, providing a chance to stock up on meat, furs, and hides. Hunters tracked deer, turkeys, and smaller animals, while rivers offered fish before freezing. Collected furs were cleaned and stretched to prevent decay, adding both warmth and trade value. Community cooperation reached its peak during this stage. Families helped one another secure barns, repair fences, and move firewood closer to homes. These efforts ensured that neighbors would not face winter alone. Shared labor often ended with communal meals, reinforcing bonds that had proven essential during past seasons of hardship. Water access was secured for winter use. Wells were cleaned and insulated, and barrels were filled with water in case rivers froze. Settlers recognized that limited water access could quickly turn minor hardships into life-threatening situations. Health considerations were especially important at this stage. Families stockpiled medicinal herbs, salves, and other remedies for cold-related illnesses. Simple hygiene practices such as cleaning living areas and boiling water reduced the risk of disease during months of indoor confinement. Children participated in all stages of preparation. They carried small bundles of firewood, gathered vegetables, and helped organize storage. Learning responsibility through active participation ensured that they would be capable of maintaining survival skills in adulthood. The emotional atmosphere during this period was a mix of anticipation and tension. Families worked tirelessly to complete tasks before the first heavy snow. While the progress of harvest and preparation brought satisfaction, the looming reality of winter kept everyone alert and focused. Evenings were filled with planning. Families reviewed supply inventories, checking that food, firewood, clothing, and tools were sufficient. Settlers discussed strategies for dealing with sudden storms or illness. Knowledge gained from previous winters guided these decisions, creating a culture of careful preparation. By the end of this stage, homesteads were transformed. Cabins were insulated and organized, barns were secure, storage areas were full, and firewood was stacked in abundance. Livestock were protected, and families had accounted for nearly every possible need. The frontier, once harsh and unforgiving, now appeared manageable. Yet pioneers understood that preparation alone did not guarantee safety. Winter remained unpredictable, capable of delivering storms, blizzards, and extreme cold despite every precaution. Survival depended not only on material readiness, but also on vigilance, endurance, and adaptability. With all preparations complete, families waited for the first snowfall, knowing that months of hardship and planning would soon be tested. The lessons of previous winters, combined with careful work throughout the warmer seasons, gave them the best possible chance of enduring the challenges ahead.
With the first snowfalls of winter arriving, pioneers faced the ultimate test of their endurance, preparation, and resilience. Months of planting, harvesting, and storing supplies now culminated in the coldest and most dangerous season of frontier life. Every barrel of food, stack of firewood, and repaired structure became essential to survival. Early snowstorms often arrived unexpectedly. Thick flakes covered the ground rapidly, transforming familiar trails into slippery and hidden obstacles. Settlers navigated these conditions carefully, using walking sticks or guiding animals through known paths. Mistakes could result in falls, lost supplies, or wandering too far from the safety of home. Cabins became the center of life. Inside, families worked to maintain fires that provided heat and cooked food. Firewood was carefully rationed, placed in the fireplace or stove as needed to conserve supply for the long winter ahead. A well-stoked fire meant warmth, protection against frost, and the ability to boil water for cooking and drinking. Meals relied heavily on preserved food. Dried vegetables, salted meats, and stored grains formed the bulk of daily sustenance. Cornmeal was cooked into porridge or baked into simple bread. Vegetables were boiled, while meat was often stewed or roasted over open flames. Every calorie was valuable, providing the energy necessary to endure cold and heavy labor. Maintaining clothing and bedding was critical. Wool garments were layered to retain heat, while blankets were shared among family members during the coldest nights. Leather boots were worn continuously to protect feet from frostbite, and mittens, hats, and scarves were kept dry to prevent illness. Livestock needed constant attention. Animals were fed carefully rationed hay and grain, and water sources were checked regularly to prevent freezing. Pioneers often had to break ice in troughs or rivers, ensuring their animals remained healthy and productive. A weakened animal could threaten survival, as livestock provided milk, meat, labor, and warmth through hides. Snowstorms sometimes isolated families entirely. Trails became impassable, and travel between settlements was dangerous. During these periods, rationing became stricter. Settlers monitored food supplies daily, adjusting portions to ensure that no one ran out before the next thaw. Hunting and fishing became more difficult in winter. Animals moved less and were harder to track, while rivers and streams often froze solid. Those with experience used traps along known paths and ice fishing holes, relying on skill and patience to supplement stored food. Winter storms also tested cabin structures. Heavy snow and ice placed weight on roofs, and settlers had to remove buildup to prevent collapse. High winds battered walls and doors, requiring constant reinforcement of logs and sealing gaps with mud, clay, or moss. Failure to maintain shelters could result in dangerous exposure to cold and wind. Health became a daily concern. Cold temperatures, limited sunlight, and reduced physical activity weakened immune systems. Illnesses spread easily within confined cabins, and injuries were more dangerous in freezing conditions. Settlers relied on herbal remedies, careful hygiene, and attentive care to manage sickness. Children remained active participants despite the cold. They assisted with feeding animals, chopping small pieces of firewood, and gathering snow for water. Work was a necessity, and learning survival skills during harsh conditions ensured the next generation could endure the frontier life. Isolation weighed heavily on mental health. Long winter nights created a sense of monotony and anxiety. Families used storytelling, singing, and games to maintain morale. Religious practices and prayer also offered comfort during these long months of confinement. Predators posed a constant threat. Wolves and coyotes moved closer to settlements, searching for food. Families remained vigilant, protecting both livestock and stored food. Dogs, fences, and watchfulness were key defenses against these dangers. Despite the hardships, winter provided a time of reflection. Settlers considered lessons learned during previous seasons, assessed their preparations, and adapted strategies for survival.
The knowledge gained over months of planning and experience often meant the difference between enduring the season safely or facing serious loss. By the end of the first harsh month, those who had prepared well were still safe, their homes secure, and their families nourished. While snow continued to fall and temperatures dropped, careful planning and daily diligence allowed pioneers to survive. The early part of winter tested resilience, but those who adapted continued to live and prepare for the midwinter challenges ahead.
As midwinter settled across the frontier, the harshest conditions of the season arrived. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and snow piled high, covering fields, forests, and trails. The work of survival became relentless, testing both physical endurance and mental fortitude. Every aspect of life, food, warmth, shelter, and safety, required constant attention. Cabins became both refuge and workplace. Families spent most of their days inside, tending fires, preparing meals, and maintaining their homes against storms. Firewood was in constant use, and each log carefully added to the flames ensured warmth through bitter nights. Settlers understood that running out of firewood was one of the greatest dangers in winter. Meals remained simple but nourishing. Cornmeal porridge, dried vegetables, salted meat, and preserved fruits made up the diet. Pioneers carefully rationed food, balancing calories with the need to preserve supplies for weeks to come. Hunting opportunities were limited, so reliance on stored provisions was essential. Water was collected by breaking ice in rivers or wells. Settlers often melted snow over fires for cooking and drinking. Keeping water from freezing required vigilance, and missing a daily collection could leave families without essential hydration. Livestock care became increasingly challenging. Deep snow made it difficult to move animals or access pastures. Settlers cleared paths and ensured water troughs remained ice-free. Feeding schedules were strict, rationed according to available hay and grain. Healthy animals were crucial as they provided milk, meat, and labor for essential tasks. Health concerns were amplified during midwinter. Exposure to cold, heavy workloads, and limited nutrition created vulnerability to illness. Respiratory infections were common, and frostbite was a constant risk. Settlers relied on herbal remedies, careful clothing, and warmth to survive these dangers. Storms could arrive without warning. Blizzards and heavy snowfall trapped families indoors, and strong winds threatened the structural integrity of cabins and barns. Settlers reinforced walls, cleared roofs of snow, and tied down doors to withstand the force of winter. Vigilance often meant life or death. Children adapted to winter routines by assisting adults with indoor tasks. They chopped kindling, helped with cooking, and monitored small animals. Though play was limited, family cohesion and shared labor ensured survival and taught essential skills for adulthood. Social interaction decreased as travel became nearly impossible. Neighbors were isolated by snowdrifts, relying on pre-stocked supplies and careful planning. Letters or occasional visits were rare, emphasizing the importance of preparation and self-reliance. Predators became a significant concern during midwinter. Wolves and other animals driven by hunger approached settlements more frequently. Families maintained vigilance, using dogs, fences, and watchful eyes to protect both livestock and stored food. A single breach could result in loss of valuable animals or provisions. Mental resilience was as critical as physical preparation. Long nights, confined spaces, and constant vigilance created stress and fatigue. Families relied on storytelling, singing, and prayer to maintain morale. The ability to endure emotionally during these months was as vital as surviving the cold itself. Regular maintenance of clothing and bedding was crucial. Wet garments were dried by the fire, wool garments were repaired promptly, and blankets rotated to keep all family members warm. Every detail mattered in preventing illness and frostbite. Daily routines remained structured.
Firewood management, water collection, food preparation, and animal care were carefully timed to ensure no essential task was overlooked. Even minor mistakes could compromise safety. By late midwinter, settlers had developed a rhythm. Experience taught them to anticipate storms, conserve resources, and adapt quickly to changing conditions. Families who had prepared carefully were secure, though still alert, knowing winter could deliver unexpected challenges at any time. Despite isolation, scarcity, and extreme cold, pioneers demonstrated remarkable endurance. Their success in surviving midwinter depended on months of preparation, careful rationing, and unwavering diligence. The final stage would explore late winter and early thaw, when the cycle of hardship began to ease, marking the transition from survival to recovery and preparation for the next growing season.
As winter began its final phase, settlers watched for signs of the long-awaited thaw. Snow and ice still covered the land, but subtle shifts, longer daylight hours, slightly warmer temperatures, and the slow flow of rivers hinted at the approach of spring. This transition marked a period of relief, reflection, and careful preparation for recovery after months of hardship. Food supplies, carefully rationed through midwinter, began to last longer as early signs of thaw allowed families to supplement diets. Snow melting near cabin sites revealed patches of hardy greens and early sprouts, providing small but valuable additions to meals. Preserved foods, salted meats, and dried grains remained the backbone of nutrition, sustaining families through the final frigid weeks. Livestock benefited from the slight warming. Snow softened, allowing animals to graze on emerging grasses. Settlers continued to provide supplemental feed, but the return of natural forage eased the burden on stored supplies. Healthy animals meant milk, meat, and labor remained available, easing the strain on families who had worked tirelessly to keep them alive. Cabin maintenance continued even as conditions improved. Roofs were cleared of lingering snow, chimneys were checked for cracks, and walls inspected for drafts. Any damage from storms during midwinter was repaired immediately, preventing exposure to lingering cold. Settlers understood that failing to maintain shelters could undo months of careful preparation. Early spring also brought the opportunity to gather water more easily. Thawed streams and rivers provided fresh, flowing water, reducing reliance on melted snow or frozen wells. Access to abundant water allowed families to clean living areas, prepare food more efficiently, and maintain better hygiene. Hunting and fishing slowly resumed. Animals emerged from hiding and fish returned to open waters. These resources supplemented stored provisions, offering fresh protein and encouraging families to venture outdoors after months of confinement. Experienced hunters and fishers guided children in these activities, teaching survival skills crucial for the next generation. Mental and emotional recovery accelerated during this period. The return of sunlight, birdsongs, and open landscapes lifted spirits. Families spent more time outdoors, engaging in work, play, and communal gatherings were possible. After months of isolation, even brief interactions with neighbors provided reassurance and strengthened social bonds. Planning for the coming growing season began in earnest. Settlers inspected fields, cleared debris from snowmelts, and evaluated soil for planting. Lessons learned from the past year shaped strategies for crop rotation, seed selection, and garden layout. Preparation during this late winter period determined the efficiency and success of spring planting. Firewood management continued, though the urgency eased slightly. Remaining stacks were organized for future use, ensuring that supply was ready for the next winter. Settlers recognized that preparation was a continuous cycle, and diligence during these months paid off in long-term security. Children's roles shifted toward recovery tasks. They helped repair fences, gather early forage, and assist with planting preparation. These activities combined learning with productivity, reinforcing survival skills that had been cultivated over the winter. Health improved steadily. Exposure to fresh air, slightly higher temperatures, and improved diets helped families regain strength lost during the harsh months. Pioneers remained vigilant for lingering winter illnesses, but recovery was noticeable as energy returned to both adults and children. Community connections strengthened further. Settlers who had weathered winter in isolation began sharing surplus food, seeds, and labor. These exchanges reinforced bonds essential for survival, creating a network of mutual support that would endure through the next year. Reflection became a part of daily life. Families recounted lessons learned, assessed successes and failures, and planned for the future. Knowledge gained during the frozen months informed every decision, from crop selection to food preservation techniques. Survivors understood that preparation, adaptability, and cooperation were as important as courage. By the time snow finally receded from most areas, the frontier was transformed. Families emerged from months of confinement, homes and barns intact, food and firewood secured, and livestock healthy. The landscape, once threatening and frozen, now offered resources for rebuilding strength and preparing for new planting.
Winter survival on the frontier had tested every skill, from physical endurance to careful planning, from emotional resilience to community cooperation. Pioneers who endured emerged stronger, wiser, and better prepared for the ongoing challenges of life in the wilderness. The frozen frontier, though harsh and unforgiving, taught lessons of survival, resourcefulness, and perseverance that would guide families for generations to come.